So you want to invest in Tesla, Apple, or some other stock, but are wondering if this is the right time to buy. We have something called stock multiples to help us determine if a stock is cheap or expensive. In this video, I will share with you some of the favorite multiples analysts love to use when valuing companies, like the PE ratio, price to sales ratio, or EV to EBITDA ratio, and also what multiples to use for growth and for mature companies. So, what are stock multiples? First, we must understand what stock multiples are before we can use them. Right now, Tesla trades at roughly $1,100, while Apple trades at $180. Does that mean Tesla is more expensive than Apple? That's not quite how it works. See, stock multiples compares the stock price to some fundamental number. For example, Tesla is trading at $1,100, and by dividing it to the earnings per share, we get the PE ratio. Generally speaking, the higher the stock multiple, the more expensive the stock is. We also have to compare the multiples to other companies in the same industry or historical averages, otherwise the multiples have no meaning. A PE ratio of 15 means nothing in and of itself. Now, how do we know what multiples to use when? Well, for mature companies with positive earnings, the PE ratio, for example, will be a good indication of how much investors are willing to pay per dollar of earnings. For growth companies, on the other hand, which tend to have negative earnings, the PE ratio will be negative and is therefore not the best application. The EV to EBITDA or price to sales ratio are more commonly used for growth companies with negative earnings. Now that we have understood what stock multiples are and what multiples to use when, we can first look at the most commonly used equity multiple, the PE ratio, which is computed by taking the share price and dividing it by earnings per share, which is also available in the company's earnings report. As we said earlier, the PE tells us how much investors are willing to pay for every dollar the company makes. For example, tech companies have a higher PE multiple than companies in the utilities sector, so we have to compare the PE ratio to other PE ratios in the same industry, and also look at earlier PE ratios for the company. Growth companies like Snowflake will normally have a negative PE ratio, and we therefore have to use other metrics to determine if it is undervalued. So let's look at Apple's PE ratio and compare it to its peers. First, we take the stock price and divide it by the EPS, which can be found in the company filings, or you take earnings and divide it by number of shares outstanding, and we get a PE ratio of 31.65. Comparing it to the PE value of its peers and Apple's 5-year average PE ratio, we have to say that Apple is expensive based on a PE basis. So number 2 is the price to book ratio. This is useful if assets primarily drive earnings, like the finance sector. The price to book ratio shows the value given by the market for each dollar of the company's net worth and is mostly used by value investors. The ratio can tell us if the market price of a company is reasonable compared to its balance sheet. It is computed by taking the share price and dividing it by book value per share. You get book value per share by taking the equity and dividing it by the number of shares outstanding. If we look at the case of JP Morgan, the stock price is 158.35 and we divide it by book value per share, we get a price to book value of 1.83. Comparing it to the price to book value of its peers and the 5-year average book value, we can say that JP Morgan is expensive on a price to book basis. The next one on the list is the price to sales ratio. It is useful for firms that make losses. In other words, growth companies. The ratio tells us how much investors are willing to pay per dollar of sales for a stock. It is computed by taking the share price and dividing it by sales or revenue per share. Sales per share is calculated by taking the revenue from the income statement and dividing that by the shares outstanding. We can calculate it for NEO by taking the stock price and dividing it by the sales per share, and we get 8.94. Comparing it to its peers, which is 18.27, and its 5-year average 10.46, we can say that NEO is undervalued on a price to sales basis. The last one that analysts love to use is EV to EBITDA, and it is a metric to determine the value of a company. It is the most used enterprise value multiple, and it is computed by taking the enterprise value and dividing it by earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. This is the multiple that has the most work, but you can also find it on Yahoo Finance along with all the other multiples I've mentioned, but for the sake of this video, we will calculate it by ourselves. First, we have to find the enterprise value, which is found by taking the market cap, adding total debt, and subtracting cash. Then, we can find the EBITDA by looking at the company's income statement. We will use Tesla as an example here. First, we calculate the enterprise value, and then we divide it by the EBITDA, and we get 145.45. Comparing it to its peers, which is 10.79, and its 5-year average, which is 188.8, we can say that Tesla is overvalued when comparing it to its peers, but undervalued when looking at the average for the company. Thanks a lot for watching this video. Drop a like and also subscribe so that others can benefit from this video. Follow me on Instagram to learn more about stocks at @SabaInvest.